Hey everybody, welcome to the Better Student Ministry Podcast. My name is Jared Berry.
And my name's Mark Freeman, and together we have over 30 years of youth ministry experience.
We created this resource to be of value to you and your youth ministry team. Hopefully you enjoy it, you benefit from it. Our goal is to invest in you as youth leaders so that you can invest in your students.
If you found this useful, please like and share with as many people as possible so that we can see better student ministries.
Hey everybody, welcome to Better Student Ministry. My name's Jared.
And my name's Mark.
We're glad to be back.
That's
Another
right.
podcast.
Yeah. And you know what? I'm sick and tired of this podcast. I quit. I'm out of here.
Hey, don't quit, Mark. In fact, let's talk about that today on the podcast.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. Great creative intro. That was awesome. Well, that is great though. You know, Christmas is over. All the holiday cheer is gone.
Right.
People did not get what they wanted for Christmas presents.
We're already now a couple of weeks into ruining all of our New Year's resolutions. There's no hope.
This is the point when we're like, okay, the diet's not happening again.
Yeah.
I guess I'll have to wait till next year.
Right. Or like, I love that you have to wait till like the beginning of a month to reset. Like, all right, February is coming soon. I can reset then versus I'll make a better choice next.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then February 2nd, when you blow it, you're like, ah,
Yeah.
all right, I guess March.
Yeah. Okay. But between now and Easter.
You cannot start a diet
No.
halfway through a month. We all know that.
Yeah. It's silly.
Yeah. So anyway, we know that, you know, it could be the holiday blues right now or just in general.
Yeah.
And we know in ministry, in youth ministry in particular, because you and I both have done youth ministry for a very, very long time, there can be a lot of seasons where you are going to ask yourself the question, should I quit youth ministry?
Right. What am I doing? Should I even be here any longer? I don't know that I was ever effective. So maybe I'll do everyone a favor, my family included, and just say, hey guys, this was a good run.
Right.
Thankfully, Jesus loves you because I don't, and just move on.
And surely there's some sort of job where I could do the things I love, make 6-7 figures,
Right.
living on a beach.
Yeah.
It's got to be, you gotta be there. So
I mean, that's the culture we live in right now. Everything is remote. I can do it from Fiji.
Right.
If only youth ministry could be that way. Am I right?
Exactly.
Hey, I love that idea, though, of thinking through the seasons of ministry, right? Youth ministry guru David Hertwick. Now, I don't know that he coined this idea, but I've heard him teach on it a lot. And it's this idea of life in general comes in seasons, right? But certainly in ministry, it's easy to apply that there's different seasons in ministry. And one of the things that he's taught a lot about or that I've heard others teach about it is this idea that seasons don't last forever, right? Every season has a beginning and an end. And there's things to be learned in every season, right? Every season is kind of preparation for the next season. And so I know when I think through my years of ministry, when I kind of like blur my eyes and think back across years of ministry, even seasons in my life right now, even applying that to seasons of like family life as well, all of those things kind of ring true, right? If you've got young kids, you know that season doesn't last forever, and you're thankful to God for that because you're like, oh, I can sleep again eventually sometime. But thinking through the idea that every season has a purpose and every season is preparation for the next season. Right. So that applies whether it's a good season or a bad season, right? I got to remind my heart, if I'm in a really good season right now, I got to cherish that season. I got to nurture it. I got to learn from it because the next season might not be the same. But there's things that I can learn or remind myself or preach to my heart like, okay, it's not always like this. We've had good seasons, that sort of thing. And the same thing obviously is true in the difficult seasons of ministry and life. Like you recognize this season won't last forever. Sometimes that's hard to see in the middle of the season, which is why you have to keep reminding yourself, preach that gospel, that truth to your heart in a lot of ways. Like, one, I'm not alone in this season, right? Christ is always with me in the season. Also, hopefully I've got people around me that'll help me through a season. But there is something to learn in this season, right? Yeah. So like in the bad seasons, I'm like, Jesus, help me learn this lesson real quick so I can get out of this season into the next one. But some of the things we want to talk through today is kind of reflecting on some of the seasons of our own ministry, thinking through what were some of the obstacles that we confronted in those seasons, and how do we filter them and how do we process them so that there's longevity and health in ministry.
Yeah. And if you're listening or watching and you are currently asking yourself this question, should I quit?
Yeah.
we want to encourage you and say, number one, you're not alone.
Yeah.
We've both been there.
Yeah.
Has have many workers in youth ministry and people that are in ministry in general. You're not alone. But
Yeah.
we also want to encourage you. We're super glad you're watching and listening, because we're going to dive into some of these topics that you may relate to. Some of them, all of them, whatever. And our hope today is to not give a blanket statement of definitely don't quit or 100% you should, because every situation is different. We're not going to stand here. We don't know your situation. Maybe you should quit. I don't know, right?
Right.
But what we are hoping to do is to give you encouragement and to say, pause, think through these things, and make a decision based out of what ultimately God wants you to do, what's best for your family, and maybe the way you're seeing it currently is simply a season that, if given time and better perspective, things could really change for you down the line.
Yeah.
So that's our hope.
Yeah. So I guess it may make most sense then, and you would think you don't have to say this, but I think it's important to say, is like the beginning of every season, especially frustrating seasons, have to be focused in prayer and reliance on, okay, God, you got to show up in this season because I can't do it on my own, right? And in reality, a lot of those seasons, those are some of the most growing seasons because you have to rely on God. Like when I think back on my seasons of youth ministry, the really good seasons sometimes ended with me being really unhealthy because I could either kind of go on autopilot or I'm just living on the high of the good things that are happening, and I'm just like, oh, I'll give a wink and a nod to God and be like, hey, I got this, let's keep going, kind of a thing. Yeah. But those deep, heavy seasons, man, for me personally, it really galvanizes me and causes me to it in a really healthy way reframes who's in charge here, what's the purpose, taking that burden off myself, things like that. So those are just some of the things that you learn, but I'm sure we'll talk about those things as we move forward.
So the first one we want to dive into, and this may be one of the reasons why you're saying should I quit ministry today, is I'm having issues with my lead pastor.
Oh, you're going to get right into it.
Let's get right in.
Does that happen? I've not ever
in my experience, it's a few times here and there that youth pastors. I was actually just in a meeting talking to a bunch of state leaders who are all lead pastors, and my role is helping support youth pastors. So I was sharing with them, and I think a little bit to their surprise, like the reality is, many conversations that I have are with youth pastors who are having friction with their lead pastor. Like this is a very common thing. And I think for a couple of reasons. Sure. Number one, you typically have a generational gap. Lead pastor is usually a little bit older than the youth pastor, right? You also sometimes have a cultural gap, could be a theological gap, and we'll get into some of that stuff. But I want to start off by saying this is normal. Yeah. I'm not saying it's good. Right. But what I am saying is it's normal. And so if this is the issue you're facing, it could be a reason to move on or transition, but not necessarily. Sure. Like what you're experiencing right now is kind of a normal thing that both you and I have experienced and gone through in our own seasons of ministry.
Yeah, I guess if I were to make a recommendation in that scenario, that difficult season, I would say the place to start, and maybe in all these scenarios we'll find this will be true, the place to start has got to be with your own heart, right? So I would recommend start with figuring out, okay, if there's conflict, if there's tension between me and my leader, or even other leaders on the staff with you, is this a and it could be, the answer could be yes to both. Is this a me issue? Is this a them issue? Is this a philosophy of ministry difference? Is this really a personality difference? And is this I don't understand my role and my position on the team and what I need to focus on? And so this year in general has really been a mantra in my own heart. Like, I want to pray this idea of like, God, search my heart. Reveal my anxious thoughts. If there's any way that's wrong within me, reveal that and lead me in your way everlasting. Right. So this idea of I want to start with my own heart. I'm trying to remind myself that in any situation, I could be the issue, right? Yep. And I think it's easy sometimes, and with like naively or with good intention, to think, I know I'm right in this, and they got to be wrong because that doesn't make any sense, or it's foolish, or it's illogical, or it's whatever. But I have found in almost every one of those seasons, if I am able to check my own heart first, then it begins to lay the groundwork of really kind of thinking critically through, and it positions my heart in the right place to hear from God, allow the Holy Spirit to reveal something if there's an issue. And like I said, it's never as simple as they're wrong, I'm right, or I'm wrong, they're right. It's always very nuanced. But if I can position my heart to hear from the Holy Spirit and admit that I could be wrong in some things, then it allows me to pace through that season with some clarity.
Yeah, I had a situation like this in my own life where one of the churches that I was at, the lead pastor and I had a lot of friction in our relationship, a lot of tension, and it was really difficult, really challenging. And I remember walking through it and thinking, I just want to leave. I just want to leave. And I actually had an opportunity, which for me at the time felt like a dream opportunity. Great friend of mine said, hey, do you want to come, work for me? And someone I really respect and looked up to. And on paper, it was like, gosh, this is God's answer to prayer, is a dream. And I remember praying about it, and very clearly the Lord said, no, you're supposed to stay where you are.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, man, and I didn't want to do it. But I remember having that mindset during that time, which you just described, which is I have so much to teach my lead pastor. He's in the wrong. I'm in the right. And there were a lot of things that I was justified in feeling that way. And so if you're a youth pastor right now and you're feeling that way, we're not saying that you are not justified in what you're feeling. However, because I knew that God had told me to stay put, I started to work on trying to go, how do I figure him out more? How do I help him figure out my heart more?
Yeah.
What is he not seeing in me that he needs to? And for this particular situation, one of the things that I realized is for this lead pastor, he really valued loyalty, and there was some perception that maybe that wasn't quite there, or I hadn't proven that yet, and that maybe my personality is I tend to be a critical thinker. I'm not afraid to kind of share my opinion, and I'm definitely not a yes man. And if you have that personality, but they don't trust that you're for the organization, there can be a lot of question marks.
Sure, yeah.
And so I finally kind of realized that. And as I started to work more and more on the relationship, what I realized is what you just described, which is there was a lot of stuff in my own heart that was as much of the problem.
Yeah.
And that God, as he started to work in my heart, and I can't control this other person. I couldn't control my lead pastor. But as he started to work in my heart and I started to humble myself and try to figure this out, what ended up happening is wild, where over time the relationship got better and better and better. And at the end of my time, because I'm not at that church anymore, to this day, I view that person as a spiritual father, as a friend, as someone that I love that man.
Yeah, and imagine if you quit the process early, right?
Yeah.
There'd probably be bitterness in your heart. There'd still be
100%.
anger. Certainly that door would be closed.
We wouldn't have relationship.
Yeah.
I still call him now when I have issues in my life. And so I learned so much about myself. He also, in the process, here's what I realized. I thought I had something to offer him.
Yeah.
What I realized is we had something to offer each other.
That's good.
And if you quit,
Yeah.
you lose out on having that happen. And
Sure.
sometimes what is down the road is way more beautiful than you could imagine. But if you leave in the moment, you'll never get there.
Yeah. I very much appreciate that, and have recognized that there were certain seasons in my ministry. Now, thankfully, there was never personality conflict issues between me and the head lead pastor at my church that I was at for 13 years. But there were lots of times where there was very different opinions about how we should proceed with something, philosophy of ministry stuff a little bit, but mainly hey, this is what we're doing as a church. And I maybe in a bad way, I kind of pride myself on thinking I can troubleshoot situations pretty quickly. I think it's a gift that God has given me to be able to look at a situation, identify a problem, and be like, I don't know about this.
Yeah. And
so there would be a lot of differences of opinion, sometimes some pretty significant differences of opinion where there was some pretty decent pushback on both sides. But one of the things that I was thankful for with my lead pastor was that I always felt heard. He may not have always agreed with me, but I always felt heard. And one of the keys to that, I think, is knowing when to when is the best time to approach a difference of opinion? Because there's good times, like setting a time, letting them know, hey, I want to talk about this, kind of prepares everybody for the conversation, knowing like, hey, I've got some concerns about something, and I'd love for you to, like, if they're prepared to hear you out, then the conversation would go better. Versus in the middle of a staff meeting, you're like, this is ridiculous. Are you guys crazy? Like, so like how you approach a situation, how you talk about a difference of opinion is really, really important. Giving both sides time to prepare and think through, but then also like humbly walking into the situation and saying, I see this differently. I'm hoping that you'll hear me out on this. But then also over time being one of the, loyalty is such a big deal, right? And longevity kind of buys you some loyalty. Like we've been through it together. We've gone through a long time. And over time, he knew that even if we disagreed about something and he made a decision that we were going to move forward on, I was going to do everything in my power to make that the best version of whatever it could be. And so over time, I built some equity, relationship equity, and some trust equity and those sorts of things. And there were times where I would present an idea that he's like, you know what, I think you might be right in that. And we'd move in a different direction for something. But understanding my position that he was the lead pastor, the lead vision caster for the church, and that wasn't my role. That wasn't my seat. It was really important for me to understand my position, my positional authority, and some things. Of course, that's easy when there's a lot of respect and trust with the lead pastor. It gets harder when there's potential lack of trust. If you're worried about decisions that are being made, if there's even kind of this feeling of integrity issues about decisions that are being made, and that's where you have to immediately run to the heart piece. Okay, am I interpreting this wrong? What does history say about these sorts of things? And like we said up front, you may get to a point where you realize this is unhealthy. This relationship is not healthy for the two of us. I care too much about this local church, this body of people, even to some degree the leader, to stay here and feel the way that I do. The number of times that I would try to filter through this idea of like, I'm not sure that it's healthy for me to be here, but I'm not sure that it's healthy for them, for me to be here as well. And I think that's part of the search your heart, allow the Holy Spirit to reveal those sorts of things.
Yeah, and 2 tips just practically that I would encourage you to do is, number 1, just pray for your pastor.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Which is harder than you think, especially when you have
strong
feelings.
And it can't be, God, change their heart on this, right? Help them to see that I'm right in this.
Pray blessing on them.
Absolutely. It's hard to... I mean, I've read this in all sorts of books regarding forgiveness or regarding just relationships and healthy Christian relationships in general. I can't pray for your blessing and then also curse. Well, I can. But then the issue is
not
squarely on me as well, right? Like I can't curse you with my words and pray for blessing on you and those sorts of things.
Yeah. So pray blessing over them.
Yeah.
And then I think like we have said, this is one thing that I try to do, and just a practical tip is, one thing I realize is when you're out of the situation and you look back, it's easier to appreciate the gifts of people. And not see their flaws. But when you're in it, it's very hard to appreciate things. All you kind of see is flaws. So try to, in your mind, separate yourself and think to yourself, what are the things that they're great at? What are some of the real gifts that they have? And try to focus on that, because nobody's perfect. Nobody's the same. And your gifts may be different than their gifts. And appreciating each other's gifts and putting those together is really the key.
One of the things that we teach all the time as it relates to having great teams, and this leader, second chair leader, thing is a big piece of this, is like, how can my gifts cover their weaknesses? How can their gifts cover my weaknesses? And if we do that, if that's the perception that we have on how we work as a team, then everyone's gonna succeed together, right?
Yeah, for sure. So that's lead pastor. That could be one issue. Another issue is, let's just talk practical kind of youth ministry stuff. So it could be, I know seasons for me, my youth group was really challenging. Like maybe it was the students. I remember the first church I was at, there was only a handful of students and they didn't want to be there. And it was just like, gosh, these kids are hard. Or the second church when I first started, I remember there was tons of sexual stuff happening, and it was just a disaster when I walked in. And I remember going like, man, this is terrible, right? So it could be students. Maybe it's leaders. You don't have any leaders. Your leaders are terrible. You feel alone, right? And could be resources. We've got no money to do the stuff I want to do. If I only had more resources like this other youth group, I could do this and then, right? So let's talk a little bit about those seasons when I want to quit because things in my youth group are bad.
When I when I think of that concept and I kind of reflect on my years of ministry, I think so much of it had to do with the group of kids that were in the youth ministry at a given time, right? So like there were the seasons where there's like a ton of kids and everybody's excited about all the things that you're doing. Those are great seasons, right? Everybody's like, oh yeah, we'll do that, even though it's stupid. But we're like, we're in.
Yeah.
And then there were certain seasons where it was a smaller group of kids, maybe like a more serious group of kids, which I never jived well with. But you're like, come on, we just want to do some fun things together. And or like you said, there was certain seasons where I would have this great group of kids, and the next season would transition to kind of a dwindling down of the numbers. And if I just took it on face value, the number of faces I see in the room, those could be really depressing seasons. What I would realize more often than not in those seasons, there were certain really specific things that we needed to push into that a smaller group of students allowed us to do. We talk about all the time the idea of you can only disciple so many kids well, really deeply, really well. And as I reflected back, and this is where like remembering that every season is only a season, and every season has a start and stop, and multiple seasons of those things, I was able over time to realize, okay, some of our small seasons were the seasons where either there was a lot of hurt and pain amongst those students, so they're not inviting their friends constantly because they're just trying to deal with their own life right now, and so, but it allowed us to go really deep and really personal with those kids in that smaller season. And so the one-on-one discipleship times were really significant and really powerful. And then we were able to cultivate some health in them by pacing with this smaller group, which then in turn they start to feel comfortable bringing their friends in, and they want them to be a part of the loving environment, and the group starts to grow again. But if you're just counting faces in the room and you're like, oh, last year at this event we had 65 kids, or depending on, we had 20 kids, now we've only got 5 kids sitting in the room, like that could be really frustrating if you don't realize what season you're in and what that season requires and needs.
Yeah, I remember a couple of these seasons throughout my time. Like when I first started youth ministry, I got to the church and it was basically a youth ministry plant. It was like, and I had all these ideas of, again, it was going to be so much fun. Youth group on Friday night. I was playing all these games out, and I'd plan these games out, and I'd be like, all right, guys, we're going to do this. And then we don't want it. Can we just take a nap? And I'm like, what? Take a nap? Like, I was like, what are these non-fun kids? And I remember my lead pastor, who had also done youth ministry, he came to me. He's like, hey, let me just share some advice with you. He's like, I'm not saying don't love and focus on all the kids. He's like, but my advice to you would be this. Don't spend all your time focusing on the juniors and seniors. Focus on the 7th graders, the 6th graders, the 8th graders.
Good.
And at first I was like, gosh, that's kind of cold.
Yeah.
But what I realized is it was a lot of wisdom, because what he was saying is, hey, love those guys and do your best for those guys.
Yeah.
But you're going to build culture and excitement, and you're going to build this youth group not on someone who's going to barely be there in 6 months, but on these kids who are actually coming up, and you have a lot of years of investment, time, and energy. And it helped put in perspective to me what youth ministry is about. Like your point, how you started seasons, right? Yeah. And our investment in students, like you reap what you sow, and sometimes it's the planting season, which is really hard. But once those crops start to bear fruit, it's really, really exciting. And so don't give up just because you're in one of those planting seasons.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would also say don't let that season define who you are as a leader.
Yeah.
Right? So I remember there were certain seasons where like I was kind of a little more embarrassed of our youth group than other seasons. Usually that was numbers related. Sometimes it was personality of the kids related. And so like a big event would be coming up. Yeah. And like you're looking around the room at other youth groups, and like if you've got like the little group with you, sometimes but that's always on you. Like when I would show up to an event and we'd have a larger group, I never looked at the other groups and was like, oh, isn't that cute? They brought their 4 kids with them. No, my heart was like, good for these leaders bringing these kids out and loving on them, and imagine the amount of attention. But if I make the season of our youth group or the temperature of our youth group a reflection of my own personality, man, I set myself up for all sorts of disaster.
Yeah. Oh, I remember being the youth group at Winter Retreat that had to send kids home because they were smoking cigarettes, and I'm like, oh gosh, I'm that youth group, you know.
Yeah.
But same thing with leaders. Like if you've had seasons, I remember season of ministry where we're doing an all-nighter, and I had leaders that were terrible. They were more work. They
Yeah.
didn't do anything. They were
Right.
more work managing them than the students. And but what I would encourage you in this is this: if you have no leaders now or terrible leaders, like my approach was this: all I need is one.
Yep.
Let me just find one who I can lean into, who can be my number two.
That's good.
And once you start one, you start to build a leadership culture.
Sure.
And that a healthy leadership culture will attract great healthy leaders. And so. Don't think too big. I got nobody. I got to get 10 leaders or 20 leaders.
Yeah.
Just start with the one, and then you'll start to build it.
That's good. In those seasons too, where you've got some frustration around the ministry or the season of ministry, or like whether it's leader issues, whether it's resource issues, those sorts of things. Don't be afraid to cast some vision for improving what those issues are. Instead of lamenting those situations, cast some vision. So thankfully finances were relatively healthy within my youth ministry over the years, but people were often an issue. And if you're just getting in front of your church on a Sunday morning and be like, man, we really need leaders to help us with our kids. We've got, we need people to come. Like, that's very different than going to people individually and saying, man, I think you would be a great mentor to teenagers. I see the way you love people. I see the way that you live your life. I want our students to look at your life and emulate that as a healthy Christian. Like, there's a big difference of how you cast vision in a difficult season. If finances are an issue, don't go to your church board or your pastor and say, man, we don't have any money for the things we want to do. Cast some vision for what it is you want to do, and then resources follow vision. At least that's the way I've seen it in my experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. And encourage people to support what you're doing. Ask for scholarships. Absolutely. Don't quit because of it. God can provide a way. There's a season for everything. So let's move on. One of the other issues kind of relating to resources and stuff is sometimes it's not a ministry resource issue, but it's personal. Yeah. Right? It's personal finances. We all know youth pastors and pastors in general don't make much money. So it could be personal finances, just a struggle of, it's always a grind. Could be personal health, your own personal health, feeling constantly stressed out, feeling like, who am I becoming? Maybe it's, if you're married, it's your marriage health, or your kids or family health. And so let's talk a little bit about that. What have those seasons been like for you? If you've had any, kind of, how do you navigate through that?
Sure. Well, one of the things that my wife and I had, so when we started youth ministry, we had one kid, and she was just a couple months old when we had her. And thankfully, she was a great baby, so she kind of just went with us different places. But then as we started having more and more kids, and as they started getting older, ministry life had to change in a lot of ways for us. And I was always thankful that my wife, Melissa, was always with me in ministry as much as she was able to. And I really relied on her. She was super wise. She loved the heck out of kids. In a lot of ways, she was a great reminder for me of what I should look like as a youth pastor. But then when we started having more and more kids, my job was as the youth pastor, not hers. Thankfully, she was as present as she could be, but there was this recognition of, she also had to oversee our family. And thankfully, we were in a situation where she was able to stay home with our kids, which, by the way, if you have any more than one kid, usually that has to be the case, because childcare is so unbelievably expensive. Right. But how she balanced her time and how we balanced our family time had to change, so that my number one priority discipleship relationship was taken care of, which was my family. Yep. How many times have we heard stories of families, or I've been at funerals where the eulogy from the kids were like, hey, you got the best of my dad or my mom, and we got what was left over at home. And so I always knew the seasons that were the healthiest in my youth ministry were the seasons where my family was prioritized and taken care of. Yep. And there were some hard seasons. Mel and I had some really difficult seasons as it related to the finances, because we made some big sacrifices for her to be able to stay home. We were a one-income family. There was a span of 6 years where we had one vehicle because we could only afford one vehicle. And so, like, trying to figure out...
that vehicle was a Ferrari.
Well, that is true.
Not super practical.
But the kids had to think I was cool, so it was a sacrifice we were willing to make as a family. So like, we had to talk through that, and my wife and I, we had to be on the same page in those seasons and figuring out the logistics of all that. I hated leaving her home with no vehicle with young kids. And so figuring out, those were hard seasons. They were difficult seasons, and trying to be on the same page about that and understand what needed to happen in our schedule and being really well planned, and preparing for if she needed to go somewhere, how are we going to figure out switching cars and all that kind of stuff. And so like the prioritizing my family first, though, I think is what helped us get through some of those lean seasons. She didn't feel like she was being forgotten. She didn't feel like she was second class to ministry. And because of that, in doing so, I could serve without feeling that regret or without feeling guilty and those sorts of things. And she was able to support and send me to do the things that we needed to do in those seasons. But
yeah, we've been there as well. I mean, personal finances is a real challenge, and I remember, for a long time, just constantly feeling like you're right on the edge there. And a couple of practical advices that I would give is, number one, you've got to learn to become really good with money, because even when you have a lot of money, if you're bad with money, it won't feel like a lot of money. But especially when you're not making much, you've got to be really good with balance budget, and how you spend your money, and really be on top of it. And so that's a skill that a lot of times youth pastors don't have, because they typically tend to be more kind of relational, fun, hanging out. So you really learn that skill, invest in learning in that. The other thing I would say is think through what are some side hustles that you can do. And there's a lot of things now that people can do to earn a little extra income.
Right.
And there's two ways you can do that. You can do side hustles that earn you income. So like I have friends that will drive Uber Eats or whatever, for a couple hours here and there, and just kind of see how much they can make. And so you can do different stuff, and maybe it's online, digital, maybe it's, guys that are doing trading or whatever it is, right? Figure out there's some side hustles that can earn more income, but you can also do side hustles that cut your expenses.
Sure.
So for us, like my wife got really great at couponing and would save us hundreds of dollars a month in couponing.
Yeah, I saw your garage the other day. You've got a lot of paper towels.
Well, that's can you not tell people that? If we have the apocalypse, I don't want. So she doesn't coupon anymore, but she did for a long time, and it saved us financially. And so, so think through that. Think through, get really good on top of your money, and then think through what are some ways that I can either make more or cut my expenses.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So another thing as it relates to like family life or resources or like personal life seasons, I recognized when I look back at my years of youth ministry, there were so many roller coasters in my own personal health in those seasons. Again, a lot of that stuff was typically attached to the health of the youth group ultimately, which by the way I recommend is a bad thing. Like your personal health shouldn't be attached to your ministry health. Now there's not that you can't be proud and give God glory for the good seasons of your life, but then usually you also do the opposite, and you're like, oh, I'm such a miserable failure when things aren't going well. But cultivating a healthy personal spirituality. And so these are some of the things that I recognized in unhealthy seasons. And so maybe hopefully this is something that they can recognize in their seasons as well. My unhealthiest seasons, usually my only spiritual time was prepping for Wednesday night service messages, things like that. So seasons that I forgot that God may want to communicate something to me personally that he's not communicating to a teenager, but I was able to justify my time, especially if time was tight, or when we had a young family and I was tired in the morning, and or if you're bivocational and you're like, I only have so many hours to get ready so it's easy to mesh those two things together. But the reality is what God is communicating to a teenager, or what truth he wants to reveal to them, is not necessarily the same truth he wants to reveal to 20-something-year-old adult married man, or woman. Or so recognizing the need to separate my ministry study time from my own personal life study time is a big thing. Talking through seasons again, the end of really positive ministry seasons tended to be the beginning of really unhealthy mark individual seasons. So like the seasons where youth ministry stuff, and because pride is like my biggest sin issue. And so like when
Glad you can admit it.
just being real out here,
Yeah,
Jared,
yeah,
being
thank you,
vulnerable.
thank
Thanks for
you.
making fun of it. So those seasons where like things are going really well
Right.
is those seasons where the enemy loves to whisper in my ear, man, you're doing a great job. Right. And so it would puff me up. And then that's when I would that's when I was easy to go into autopilot and like just kind of let things roll. But then meanwhile, my heart is starting to decay and it's starting to get
Yep.
mucky and gross. And so like, again, like maybe this isn't a quitting season, but it's a season that leads potentially to that, where
Right.
I'm not focusing on the health of my own heart, and I'm allowing the good season to set me up for the next season, which is sometimes pretty tricky,
Yeah.
dangerous seasons.
Yeah, that's
So
great. That's
just
great.
being-
so what I heard you saying is, in the midst of whatever, prioritize your personal health, whether
Yeah.
that's physical, emotional, spiritual,
Yeah.
your marriage health.
Yep.
It's not worth losing your marriage over
Absolutely.
this. And then obviously your discipleship
Yeah.
in your own home with your kids and all that.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And in that family, prioritizing that family health, like make sure you're connecting with your spouse regularly and you guys are praying together and doing something that feeds one another spiritually as well. I know there were plenty of seasons in me and my wife's life where us serving in ministry together was a surrogate for us having a spiritual life together, a spiritual relationship together. And again, just as much as it's important for you to nurture your own personal life in ministry, you can't let ministry be the substitute for you and your spouse's ministry life. So finding times to connect deeply spiritually it has nothing to do with your occupational ministry life will help cultivate a healthy spiritual life between you and your spouse as well.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about the last area,
Yep.
and which is maybe there's some theological issues that are coming up, and this is one that I've heard a lot from youth pastors. I went through this myself, and so maybe you kind of have this issue where all of a sudden you're like, oh man, I'm reading more, I'm listening more, I'm hearing more, and I'm realizing there's more out there theologically, and I'm not sure I align with
Yeah.
what I thought I aligned with and how I
Sure.
grew up, and
Yeah.
and so I had this very issue actually happened to me where I grew up on part of the Assemblies of God. I grew up in the Assemblies of God church, went to an Assemblies of God college, started in Assemblies of God church. And I remember a couple years into youth pastoring, and I was like, I started to kind of stumble across other theological perspectives, and I realized I have never questioned any of this stuff.
Yeah.
And it was this.
Well,
like,
you're not typically a deep thinker, so I could.
exactly. So it was like Pandora's box of reading and I love learning. So the deeper I went in, the more I realized I kind of had this existential crisis where I'm like, man, I've never questioned this.
Yeah.
And so I remember this feeling of like, gosh, is this even my tribe anymore?
Yeah,
What
yeah.
do I even and so I think this is, and I know having conversations with other youth pastors, this is a very real issue that happens in a lot of youth pastors that for some of them makes them go, I don't know if I should just quit.
Yeah. I can remember Melissa and I, my wife and I, we went to a big national youth conference, and we loved going to those things because it was an opportunity for us to be invested in and pour into our lives. And so at the conference, there was tons of different breakout sessions you could go to based on certain topics and ideas and things. And I remember we went to, this was right as culturally in the United States or in the world in general, it was right as things started to shift with some more embracing of alternative sexual lifestyles and things like that. It was really as it was starting to become more a public thing, and is it okay to be a gay Christian, and those sorts of conversations started happening. And this conference we went to was a non-denominational conference, and so they were trying to be really intentional about keeping the door open to anybody that was a part of it. And I remember we went to a specific training where they were extremely open to some things that I had always been taught was not good.
Yeah.
And I remember after we went to this session, my wife and I, we went back to our hotel room afterwards, and we just kind of sat and stared at each other and was like, are we wrong? Like, have we been wrong about this? Like, could we be wrong about this? Are we thinking different? Are they wrong about this? Like, there became this moment of crisis of like, wait a minute, as the culture in you, and as the youth culture was moving, have we been left behind in this? Have we not adjusted and adapted and grown at the same? Do we want to go where it seems like things are growing? Do we have the energy to fight it if the culture is going in a different direction than where we think the church should be going? And there were some legitimate moments of like really questioning and thinking through our theology. Are we wrong about this? Is this something that we need to? I feel kind of weird about like even questioning these things, but maybe I should. And so like we're like, all right, we gotta read up, we gotta know more about this to make some educated decisions. So we bought a ton of books and resources while we were there, and we're reading through things, and in a lot of ways that helped us kind of solidify what we believed and why we believed it. But recognizing the youth culture in so many ways is fighting against Christian ideals and things related to what it means to be a biblical Christian or to and so we really had to fight through. Is this a fight we're willing to lean into? Where could we be wrong about this? Where are we right? What things do we need to stand on? What things do we need to push through for the sake of our teenagers? But it was a moment of some theological / moral we feel a little lost in this.
Yeah.
It was a very strange feeling for sure.
Yeah. And I would encourage, if someone's there and they're considering, do I quit? Do I leave because of this? I would encourage you to not necessarily pause on that. And what I would say is this: keep doing a deep dive, like you talked about. That's great.
Yeah.
That's phenomenal. And what inevitably will happen is this: the more you start to learn about theology, you're going to be around people who have been doing it longer than you, that know less than you, which will discourage you. Because you're going to go, nobody even knows what they believe around here, right? But here's why you got to be careful. That will create a pride in you. And what I would suggest to you is keep learning, because here's what I think always ends up happening if you keep pursuing. You'll go past the pride stage, and then all of a sudden you'll enter humility again, because you'll realize, holy cow, there is so much that I don't know. And there's so much that's still out there. And it creates in you this theological humility. Not that you don't have convictions and believe what you believe, but for my case, I ended up going, no, I'm not. This is not perfect. This thing that I'm a part of, this group or this church, it's not perfect. But I do agree with it, and I think it's true, but I also hold a lot of my theological convictions. Like some you don't hold with humility. You're like, no.
There's some non-negotiables.
Non-negotiables. But what you'll find is a lot of it you end up having more grace and humility on. And you're like, I've done a lot of reading and research and due diligence on this, but I'm okay with kind of having some of this stuff be unknown and kind of be in flux. Or I'm okay with having ideas that I disagree with other people, and we're all brothers and sisters. So I would encourage you, keep learning, growing, but allow yourself, hold some theological humility, and don't just leave and walk away because you think everybody else is wrong and you're right.
Sure. Yeah, it's something worth fighting for, right? Absolutely. And in a lot of ways, I mean, that is so much of youth ministry, is helping pace with students, because these are the questions that they have and they're struggling with. In a lot of ways, you can model for them, like, hey, like I don't have to have the answer for everything. In fact, most of the times, like some of the deepest relationships I had with students was when they had a tough theological question that I wasn't exactly clear on, and I'd be like, let's figure this out together. Let's read some stuff together. Let's let me go do some research. Let me find out some things. And like there was an authenticity in those relationships that were really healthy and grew and blossomed. And I was able to model for them, like, when you're struggling, you don't have to have the answer for everything. That there's some grace and there's some figuring out and some sorting through and a lot of prayer, and so it's super helpful.
So lesson learned is this: should I quit youth ministry?
Yes.
We certainly hope not.
Oh yes.
No. We hope not. We hope not.
Yeah.
Stick with it. Keep fighting. Keep wrestling with the Lord. At the end of the day, my conviction is this: if God tells you to go, go. If He tells you to stay, stay. And He'll help give you what you need.
Yeah. Don't make those decisions after a really bad youth group gathering. Give it some time to breathe. Give it some time to air. In fact, a significant decision like that should always come from a season of prayer about a decision like that.
That's right.
Prioritize your health, because that it really is important. Like you can like gut something out, but if you're just eroding and dying inside, that's not healthy and helpful to the ministry ultimately.
Sure.
Anyways, always be looking and training your replacement, so when it's time for you to go, you got somebody in place.
Yeah.
But also then realize the ministry is God's. Those people are His. Those students are His. And if God is calling you away in a season, He's going to prepare the next leader for that season. And that all kind of falls to this humility thing that you have too. Yeah. Understanding not only your position with your lead pastor on your team, but your position before God and what He's called you and equipped you to do, and how He wants to use you and what seasons He wants to use you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks everybody. Keep fighting for students. We love you. We'll see you on the next podcast.
Peace.